She was soaked through by the time I got the bonnet up. The rain had been falling for 40 minutes, and she was still standing there in the navy coat that was never going to be enough for this, watching me work. And when I finally got the engine to turn over and looked up at her, she said, "I'm not going home tonight." She said it to the middle distance, not to me. The way people say true things when they're not quite ready to have said them to a person. I stood up. The rain was doing what rain does when it has decided to make a point. I said, "Okay." She stopped. She said, "My place is 40 minutes in this. The roads on the west side flood." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm just being practical." I said, "I know that too." She looked at me then, not at the car, not at the car park, at me, with the expression of someone who has just said 2 true things and 1 false one and is watching to see if I can sort them correctly. I could sort them. I had been sorting Nadia Osai's sentences for 11 months. My name is Rafe Callahan. I'm 32. I work in facilities and operations management for a property development company called Holt & Brennan. I oversee the physical infrastructure of their office portfolio, which means I am responsible for everything that holds a building together and everything that goes wrong with it. I have been in this role for 3 years. For 11 of those 36 months, my direct manager has been Nadia Osai, who came in as head of operations after the previous head left for a competitor, and who remade the department with the specific efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this problem to solve. I want to be honest about Nadia from the beginning, because the honest version is more interesting than the easy one. She was not cold. People called her cold who had not been paying attention. She was precise. There is a difference that matters enormously if you are the person being described. She ran meetings with an agenda and kept to it. She made decisions quickly and documented her reasoning, which she had told me once was partly professional discipline and partly because she'd learned early that women who make decisions need to be able to show they're working in ways men don't. She was 38. She had been in operations long enough to know every way a system could fail, and had built her management style around that knowledge, thorough, anticipatory, a step ahead of the problem. What she was, underneath the precision, was a person who found most things interesting if you gave her enough of them. She had opinions about infrastructure that were almost philosophical, the way a building tells you what it thinks of the people inside it by what it makes easy and what it makes difficult. We had had that conversation in my first week, when she was walking me through the portfolio, and I had made an observation about a stairwell that had been designed for aesthetic reasons at the expense of practical ones, and she had stopped and looked at me with the expression of someone recalibrating an expectation upward. She said, "You see buildings the way I see systems." I said, "I think they're the same thing." She said, "Yes, that's what I mean." That was the beginning of what I would describe as a working relationship of unusual quality. The kind where you understand how the other person thinks well enough to anticipate them, where you finish problems together more efficiently than either of you finishes them alone, where the professional respect has a texture that is different from ordinary professional respect, but which you treat carefully and deliberately as though it is the same thing. Her prop was the navy coat. She wore it over everything, over suits, over the one Friday casual outfit she permitted herself, over the long cardigan she kept at her desk for late nights. It was good wool, well made, the coat of a person who has decided on a thing and committed to it. It was not, in any practical sense, a raincoat. This had never mattered until October. The late nights had started in September. A portfolio audit, 3 buildings under review for a potential sale, which meant every system in every building had to be documented, verified, and presented in the kind of format that made investors comfortable. It was the kind of project that expands to fill whatever space you give it. And Nadia had given it everything. She was in before I was most mornings and still there most evenings when I was locking up, which was late. We had developed, across September and into October, the working habit of the last two people in a building. The loose version of professionalism that arrives when the audience has gone home and you are both just people trying to finish something. She made coffee badly, and I had told her once, and she had looked at me with the expression of someone filing the information for later. And the next time she made it, it was right. She ate at her desk. She asked me questions that were not always about work, and I answered them and asked some back, and we talked. In the particular register of two people who have been professional all day and are now just tired enough to be real. I knew she was recently divorced. Not recently, 2 years ago. A marriage of 7 years to a man who had been, she said, once and not again. Someone she had chosen for the person she thought she was going to become, rather than the person she actually was. I knew she had a flat on the west side that she had described as too big for one person and too full of other people's decisions, which she was gradually remaking at the pace of someone with a very full job. I knew she read on her commute, and that her current book was something about urban planning that she had lent me a chapter of, because she thought I'd find it relevant. I had. I had given it back with 3 observations, and she had sat with them for a day and then told me I was right about 2 and wrong about 1, and explained why, and she had been correct. These are the things you know about a person when you have been paying careful attention for 11 months and treating the attention as ordinary. The night in question was a Thursday. The audit presentation was the following morning. We had been in the office until 9:30 finalizing the last section, and when we finally came down to the car park, the rain was already established. Not the beginning of rain, the middle of it, the committed kind. Her car was in Bay 12. Mine was 2 rows over. She said goodnight at the lift, which was what we always said in the car park, and I went to my car and she went to hers, and that should have been the end of it. I was pulling out of my space when I saw her still in Bay 12. The car hadn't moved. The headlights weren't on. I stopped. I gave it 30 seconds. I pulled back into my space and got out. She was sitting in the driver's seat with the door open and the overhead light on, looking at the dashboard with the expression she got when a system had failed in a way that was beneath her. I came around to her window. She looked up. She said, "It won't start." I said, "What does it do when you turn it?" She said, "Nothing, not even a click." I said, "Bonnet release?" She said, "Left of the steering column." She got out. She was already in the coat. The rain was personal at this point. I got the bonnet up and found what I expected to find: the battery terminals. One of them with the specific corrosion that means the connection has been degrading slowly for longer than anyone noticed. I had jump leads in my boot, which I always had, which is the kind of preparedness that comes from 3 years of being the person buildings call when things fail. I told her what I needed. She held the torch on her phone, steady, no comment about the rain, the posture of a person who has decided to be useful and is being useful, while I worked. It took 20 minutes. The engine turned over on the 3rd attempt. I straightened up. I was wet in the way that has gone past the point of mattering. She was standing beside the bonnet in the navy coat, which was doing nothing for her by this point, and the rain was in her hair and on her face, and she was looking at me with the expression she had when something had resolved, and she was deciding what to say about it. She said, "I'm not going home tonight." And then the rest, the middle distance, the practical reason, the roads, the 40 minutes, and then she looked at me. And I sorted the sentences. I said, "My place is 12 minutes. She said nothing for a moment. I said, "You can take the dry clothes option, and I can drive you in the morning, and it does not have to be anything other than the practical version. That's available, if that's what you want." She looked at me with the full attention, the recalibration look, the one from my first week, the one that meant she was updating a model. She said, "And if that's not what I want," I said, "then you should probably tell me what you want, because I am quite wet and not at my most sophisticated, and I would rather be clear than clever right now." She said, "Rafe." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have been managing something for approximately 8 months, and I would like to stop managing it." I said, "What have you been managing?" She said, "You know what I've been managing." I said, "I'd like to hear you say it." She said, "I am aware of that. I'm deciding whether I trust it." I said, "Take your time. We're already wet." Something crossed her face, not the laugh exactly, but the place the laugh comes from, briefly illuminated. She said, "The practical version is available if that's all this is." I said, "It isn't all this is." She said, "No." I said, "No." She said, "Then drive us somewhere dry, and we can finish this conversation indoors like adults." My flat is a first-floor conversion in a Victorian terrace, the kind of place that is slightly too tall for its footprint, with ceilings that surprised me when I moved in, and a kitchen that had been done by someone who understood what kitchens were for. It is not tidy in the way of someone who is expecting company. It is tidy in the way of someone who has systems and keeps to them, which is different. She stood in the hallway while I found a towel and something dry, a shirt, a pair of tracksuit trousers. Both too large, both clean. She took them without comment, then went to the bathroom and came back looking like someone who has removed the professional layer and found the person underneath, which was what she looked like. The same, but without the management of it. She sat at my kitchen table. I made tea correctly, which she noted without saying, a slight expression that I had learned to read as acknowledged. I sat across from her. She said, "I want to say something, and then I want you to say something, and then I want us to decide what we're doing." I said, "All right." She said, "I have been your manager for 11 months, and I have been professional about that. I intend to continue to be professional about that, whatever happens. If this goes somewhere and it goes wrong, I will manage that professionally also. I am not someone who can't separate things." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm telling you so it's not an unspoken variable. I don't like unspoken variables." I said, "I know that too." She said, "Good. Your turn." I said, "I have been paying attention to you for 11 months in a way that I decided was professional appreciation for someone who is exceptionally good at what she does. And I maintained that decision for approximately 4 months before it became insufficient as a description." She said, "And then?" I said, "And then I found a different filing system and kept working." She said, "What was the different filing system?" I said, "I told myself I was a person who understood the difference between what you notice and what you do about it." She said, "And?" I said, "And I still believe that. I'm also sitting here telling you this, so." She looked at me. The kitchen was quiet, except for the rain on the window, which had followed us home. She had her hands around the mug, not turning it, just holding it, the warmth of it. She said, "I lent you that chapter in the 3rd week." I said, "The urban planning one." She said, "I don't lend things to people I work with. I have a rule about it. I lent it to you, and then I went home and thought about that." I said, "What did you conclude?" She said that I was already in trouble and had better be careful. I said, "You were very careful." She said, I was extremely careful. It took considerable effort. I said, I know. I was watching. She said, I know you were. She set the mug down. She straightened slightly, the posture shift of someone who has made a decision. She said, I want to stop being careful. I said, then stop. She said, it won't be simple. I said, I know. She said, we work very well together. I said, we'll still work very well together. She said, you don't know that. I said, I know how we work. I know what happens when one of us has a problem and the other one finds it. I know what it looks like when you've solved something, and I know what it looks like when you haven't yet, and I know which one you are right now. She said, which one am I? I said, you've solved it. You've been solved since the car park. You're just finishing the documentation. She looked at me with the expression, the full one, the recalibration, the update. She said, that is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. I said, I told you. I know how you work. She said, yes. She stood up. She came around the table and stood in front of me and looked at me with the directness she brought to everything. Meetings, decisions, broken systems in rainy car parks. And she said, I am going to stop being careful now. I said, all right. She put her hand on my face. Both palms, brief, the gesture of someone locating something they want to be sure of. She said, for the record, I'm not going home because of the roads. I said, I know. She said, I just wanted that to be documented. I said, noted. She kissed me then, with the same quality she brought to everything. Decided, no excess, nothing performed. The rain continued on the window. The kitchen held us the way rooms hold things when something true is happening in them. The presentation was at 9 the following morning. We were both in the office by 8. She was in her own clothes. She had gone back to her flat at 6. Changed. Come in. I was at my desk when she arrived. She came through the office and past my desk and said, without stopping, without changing her register, the bonnet of my car needs looking at properly. Can you find me someone? I said, I'll have a name to you by 10. She said, thank you. She went to her office. Through the glass, I could see her setting up for the presentation, the particular focused preparation of a woman who had not slept very much and was not going to let that be visible. She pulled the navy coat off and hung it on the back of her chair. She sat down. She opened her laptop. She was extremely good at her job. I had always known that. It looked, from the outside, exactly the same as it always had. At 8:55, she came out and stood at the whiteboard and went through the presentation with me, a run-through, sharp, efficient, the same as always. At the end, she looked at her notes and said, anything I've missed? I said, slide 7, second bullet, the figure should be 2. 3, not 2. 8, she found it. She corrected it. She said, good catch. She went into the meeting room. I went back to my desk. At 11:15 she came out, and the expression on her face was the solved one. She stopped at my desk and said, they accepted the recommendations. I said, all of them? She said, all of them. I said, well done. She said, we did the work. She went back to her office. The day continued. I found her a mechanic by 10 as promised. She emailed thanks at 10:03. At 5:30, when the office had thinned, she appeared at my desk and said, I'm getting dinner. There's a place on Calder Street that's good, if you want. I said, Calder Street is 15 minutes. She said, I know where it is. I said, is there a practical reason we're going to Calder Street? She said, the food is good. I said, and? She said, and I'd like to have dinner with you. That's the full list. I said, I'll get my coat. She said, I'll get mine. We were not reckless about it. She had meant what she said in my kitchen. She was not someone who couldn't separate things. And we were both people who believed that work was work and required its full self, and that anything else required its full self also, and that mixing them carelessly would damage both. So, we were careful in the office. Not cold. We had never been cold. But we kept the register we had always kept, the one that had always been professional, and it always had something else underneath, and we simply acknowledged to ourselves that we now knew what the something else was. People noticed eventually. Her assistant Carla was first, in December, in the specific way of someone who had been watching for longer than you realized, and was quietly satisfied to have been right. She said nothing directly, just stopped being surprised when I appeared, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. I told my brother in January. He said, "Your boss?" I said, "My manager, technically," he said. "Is there a difference?" I said yes, and she would want me to be specific. He thought about it. He said, "Is she good?" I said, "She's the most capable person I've worked with." He said, "That's not what I asked." I said, "I know. Yes, she's good." He said, "Then don't be an idiot about it." I said, "I'm trying not to be." Nadia told her friend Josephine sometime in February. I know because Josephine appeared at a dinner we went to and said, immediately, "Before anything else, you're the one who fixed the car." I said, "I fixed a terminal connection." She said, "That's not the story she tells." I said, "What's the story she tells?" Josephine looked at me with the look of a woman who has decided to like someone before they've earned it, which is either a gift or a warning. She said, "She tells it the way people tell stories about things they've been waiting to have." I said, "I see." She said, "Good. Make sure you understand what that means." I understood what it meant. The navy coat is still the coat. She has not replaced it. I bought her a proper waterproof in March, not as a statement, just because the problem existed and I had found a solution to it, and she accepted it with the expression she gets when something is both unnecessary and correct, and she has decided to allow it. She wears both now. The waterproof when it matters. The navy one when she is at her desk and has forgotten to take it off because she is thinking about something else. I have not told her that I find the navy coat inadequate for rain, worn over everything, the coat of a person who has decided on a thing. One of the most characteristic objects I have ever encountered. She would file that information and do something precise with it at a time of her choosing. That is also characteristic, and I find it also, but that is for a different conversation. Years later, when people ask, and it comes up at dinners, at the kind of gatherings where stories get told, Nadia says, his jump leads worked. I did him the courtesy of being impressed. I say, she stood in the rain for 40 minutes holding a torch without complaining once. She says, I was being useful. I say, you were being characteristically impossible to do anything for. And you know I find that. I stop. Because there are people at the table. She looks at me with the full attention. The coat is on the back of her chair. The room is warm. She says, you can finish that sentence later. I say, I intend to. She says, good. Now let someone else tell a story. What would you have done if the person you'd been carefully not thinking about said something in the rain that made careful feel like the wrong word? And have you ever been managing a feeling so long that when you finally stopped, you couldn't remember why you'd started? Tell me in the comments. If this one landed, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.